In the room I see a lot of friends that I haven't caught up with yet this morning. Hello. And I see lots of new faces, which is great. One of our mantras, which Edward already said this morning, is that FHIR is a community as much as it is a technical standard. And so some of what I'm going to be talking about is what's new in the community, as well as what's new in the technical specification. So specifically, I'm going to talk about some HL7 organizational changes that are current. I'm going to talk about infrastructure changes in the standard itself. I'm going to briefly talk about additional functionality in the standard. We'll also talk about breaking changes, some other changes in the community. So this is HL7's official organizational strategy. We will enhance the public image and achieve recognition by stakeholders as leading SDO for worldwide health data interoperability standards. In my part of the world, which is not USA, should I speak louder or is there a volume problem? Right, maybe this will be better. Okay, great. All right. So in my part of the world, HL7 is the leading SDO, but it's not the case everywhere. But it's not really a US-focused item. HL7 needs to work on its long-term sustainable revenue, but we don't care about that here. All right, we do care about that. But the organizational strategy to establish FHIR as the primary standard for global health data interoperability. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Presently, as most of you well know, if you actually go into an institution that's providing real healthcare services and say, how much of your data interoperability is provided through FHIR versus all of the other possible standards, and the answer is generally pretty low. It's only a small fraction, but it's all the new stuff. And that's going to be the way for a little while. But and it's not our goal to see that change in the very short term, because that takes time. But if you look around the development process, the standards committees, the projects that are being initiated, the interfaces that companies are building, the percentage is very different. And the percentage there, it's earlier in the process you get, the more true it's all FHIR all the time. And so in that sense, that's where we're working to establish FHIR as a primary standard. So we want to increase our understanding of FHIR usage and value of the usage worldwide. So how many people saw the survey that I put out yesterday or HL7 announced? Not everybody. Okay, so I'll work on that this week. But we are doing a FHIR survey to find out about how people are using FHIR, what's working, what's not working. And it'll help guide us as a product in developing FHIR. So I will make sure that you will find out. I forgot to put a link in the slides, but we'll do that in the keynote. We want to work on the symbiotic link of the brand and the relationship between HL7 and FHIR. So a lot of people know about FHIR, but don't really know that it's an HL7 thing, so we're working on that. We want to demonstrate the value of FHIR in enabling interoperability. So that's ongoing work for this community, is to publish the linking the value of FHIR and interoperability, and more our business is to ensure that our resources are most effectively focused to build out FHIR. So the rest of the time I'm going to talk about what I'm doing to build out FHIR. Before I do that, there's a FHIR certification test. So we've introduced a basic FHIR proficiency certificate. It's a basic test for demonstrating that you know the specification, what's in it, what a RESTful spec is, what the licensing terms of the specification are, and the general things that are in the specification. It's not a deep and meaningful test that you know the specification inside out. That's professional certification, and we're still working on that. And the idea is that if you pass the professional certification certificate once we introduce it. It's actually will be accredited, so it's a set of letters you can put after your name. So we have to go through an accreditation process to be able to do that. But that will require deep knowledge of the specification. You'll actually have to go through a process of creating a set of resources on a special server as a prerequisite for actually sitting the certification to demonstrate you really know how the specification works. And the idea is that if you really know the specification well enough to provide reliable advice to implementer companies as a consultant or a contractor or an interoperability company, then you'd be able to pass that professional certification. But it really does test out your knowledge of the specification very well. Now, that's not available right now. At the moment, all we have is the proficiency certificate, which just demonstrates that you invested in the standard, you know what's in there. You can sit and pass that at the working group meetings or at any other time by going through a testing authority. Is there anyone in the room who's actually done that and passed that? All right, there's a few people. Great. Actually, we haven't had a lot of people do that, and it's been a bit of a surprise for us, given the number of people at conferences like this, that there hasn't seemed to be a very big market for the proficiency certificate. Does that mean that we need we actually the market is for professional certification, but that's much harder? Or does it mean that people just don't think that there's a lot of value in FHIR testing because it's so easy? Which I like that message, but it's not true. So if you have an opinion about that, I won't have a general discussion now, but if you have an opinion about that, one of me or one of the other of the HL7 leadership would be very interested in hearing your opinion on the proficiency certificate. But you can sit that now, here, while you're here. No, I think you need to go to an office for the testing authority, but you can do that anytime. All right, so now talking to the specifications. So the specifications are a cluster of specifications now. The first thing I want to talk about is they're very close to publishing a final version of a Smart App Launch specification. That's pretty high profile here, and someone's talking about that, I think, right now. And there's a series of talks here. It's a profile on OAuth and OpenID Connect that helps integrate applications around sign-on and authorization processes. Reconciliation is complete now, and we're working on publication. It's not linked to Release 4, so when it's published, it'll work for Release 2, 3, and 4. My view is that most users of FHIR will use Smart App Launch. Not all of them have to, or will, but I think most of them will. And I actually published on my blog, and link on the slide here, a way to use Smart App. A Smart App has a new way to do an integration. And this is something that comes up quite a lot for us, because people go, I've got a health record system from an existing vendor. It's much wider than the EHR question. Someone's come and asked me to do some kind of point integration with the vendor. So a classic example would be one of my clinical teams wants to take data, use cases, clinical cases from my EHR and push them up to a discipline-specific registry. So a really common kind of use case to have to come. And right now you have to go talk to the vendor, you have to get on the vendor's list, you have to pay for it, you have to go through all that process. But you don't need to do all that with a smart app, and you can work around all those things. So I talk about how you might do that on that blog post. Okay, so FHIR Release 4 itself. So hopefully you know that Release 4 is the first version that's going to have some normative content. So when we started out with FHIR, we started out and said, we wanted to answer the question, what does it look like to have an agile development process for a standard? And when we started, agile development was the big thing, and what we knew is the standards weren't agile. So what did it look like to have an agile standard? And so we set out to say, well, let's have a really agile development process. And so we put up a standard and we cycled on it, and sometimes we would cycle on it every few minutes. as we fixed things, and we created a bunch of social media-driven processes for maintaining the content. But over time, more and more people have got invested in the standard. More and more eyes have looked at it. Maybe 10, 15,000 people have implemented the specification now. And the parts that we all implement, it's getting really hard to change them, and it's getting much less necessary to change them. We've decided a lot of stuff. We've been through all the use cases. We've made our compromises. It's really hard to change them. And so over time, the content of the specification has become much more mature. And we started tracking that as a formal process, the maturity process. And then we realized that it was time to actually, for parts of the standard, to move past an agile standard and move to a formal standard that's not changing, and that protects people's investments. So there's a lot of discussion in the community about how to deal with multiple versions, which I'll talk about shortly. But it's time in the core, as the primary curator of the core content, it's really obvious that more and more of the core is stable. And more proposals for changing the core, the community just goes, no, we're not going to do that. It's just not worth it. So time for normative. So a normative standard technically means that the standard, we don't make breaking changes to the standard. Now, exactly what a breaking change turns out to be really, really tricky to define. So I'll come back to that in a second. So what we did this time is we chose 4 parts of the FHIR specification. So those of you, if you read the spec, you know the spec is actually pretty big. The spec is actually pretty big to the point that the full download is growing geometrically, and it's currently 1.7 gig, and it's turning into a monster for me to upload on my third world internet service at home where I work. So we chose 4 parts. We chose the core, the infrastructure of the specification, the definitions, the data types, the XML JSON formats, and the RESTful API, and balloted that as a package. And then we chose code system value set, concept map and structure definition, and a couple of other resources as the conformance content, and balloted those as a package. We balloted patient and observation. If these pass ballot and we publish them as normative, that means that what is there is frozen. We can add stuff, but we can't change what's there with some rules around that. The rest of the FHIR will remain standard for trial use. And if you look through the specification, you'll see a range of content from extremely immature content that could roll over really, really quickly through to normative kind of candidates that we're nearly ready for. And each page is marked with a maturity level that tells you where we are up to that. If the ballot fails, so we can't pass it as normative, then we'll just fall back to trial use and publish Release 4 anyway and try again with Release 5. So it's kind of difficult with FHIR to figure out exactly what a breaking change is. HL7 has a long history of static standards with very clear definitions about what a breaking change is. When we sit in committee and talk about possible changes in the FHIR specification, we're dealing with a much more dynamic environment, an API, business rules, expectations, validation rules. We're talking about making the introspection part of the standard itself normative. So there's parts of the FHIR of the version 2 specification that are normative that we've always made changes to because they're kind of special. And so we've run into a whole bunch of those areas in FHIR. And so there's actually a whole big long page in the spec that talks about what normative means. And I'll be investing in those pages, trying to make them clearer for implementers as we approach reballoting in September. So the terms of the ballot report, we balloted in April-May time period, and a whole bunch of people joined the ballot, and there are HL7 members who balloted, and then they made a bunch of comments around the details of those 4 packages. So you can see the counts here. I see one mistake on these slides, actually. Terminology conformance reconciliation is currently at 25%. 75% is needed. It's not clear there. So you can see that reconciliation's in process. What that means is the committee goes through each item of the hundreds and agrees with the person who made the comment and with the committee about what kind of changes we're going to make as a result of the comment. Sometimes we explain why we did what we did and the person goes, oh, okay, that makes sense. Other times we go, oh, you got a point. We never thought about that. Let's go and make some changes to the specification. And other times we go, it's kind of a weird edge case you're talking about. We'll add an extension just for you. Or you can do your own extension. We expect that they will pass, and we need to firm that up in the next few weeks. And we're pretty busy working on those things at the moment. Then what will happen is we will go back out to Ballot and say, okay, so as a consequence of the changes we made as a result of the first ballot, here's the final package. And we'll go back out to Ballot, but the ballot is closed to the people who've balloted on the first time. So how many people in the room here actually balloted on, joined the ballot? Not many people, but a good set of hands. So those people get to make the final call on what will go normative or not. The rest of you are still able to create tasks through GForge, which is what we're currently using for our task tracker. Soon, hopefully, maybe one day, we'll get rid of GForge and go to something slightly more automatable. But all of you can still create tasks, issues, change requests on any of the content in the specification, but the window for doing so is getting short now. And in the next few weeks, we're going to have to close the window and say, anything you submit after this is an R5 issue, just as a matter of publication necessity. And it depends on the nature of the problem. We'll be open for fixing typos and stuff all the way up till the end of December, but actual substantive changes, things that would actually change implementations, the lead for them is not far from now. Of course, the fact that we've been publishing multiple versions, and this will be the fourth release, means that we are having to finally pay much more attention to what it means to have multiple versions out there. So there's a few projects in the wild using version release 1 or earlier. There's projects in the wild using very, very early versions of FHIR, but they're very few and far between. And the reference implementations have started dropping support for release 1. And so really we're talking about release 2, release 3. There's a few pretty high profile projects running on one of the release 3 ballot packs, intermediate version. And there's an assortment of projects playing around with some version of release 4. But we've been paying more attention to what it means to support multiple versions. So we have an ongoing connectathon stream around supporting a single endpoint that expresses multiple versions of FHIR and other issues associated with supporting multiple versions. In release 4, we define the media type parameter FHIR version so that you can specify that this is not only FHIR content, but which version of FHIR it is. And we're defining a versions operation. So you can go to the server and say, hey, server, tell me what versions you'll support. And in fact, there's a whole page in the spec, which I will go and quickly, I'll show you around. So in the documentation page, there's a new page, managing multiple FHIR versions, which works through the different ways that you can work with multiple versions of FHIR. You're going to have different endpoints, which is what most of us have been doing, but you can also have the same endpoint. You can use the FHIR version parameter, and in fact, you can, if you really want, you can mark a resource inside the resource and say what version it is. And those have different uses and different strengths and weaknesses, which are discussed on this page. This page is new, and so I'm very very happy to receive commentary on this page. So please read it and make comment either on Julep or to one of us. Okay. So there is no way that we can make supporting multiple versions easy. Some of you, how many of you seen the R2, R3 diff in the spec? Has anyone seen that? Oh, that's a good set of hands. So in the spec, every resource and the data types, let me just pick one at random, has, in addition to these tabs, there's a tab here, Release 3 diff, which describes the changes between Release 2 and Release 3, and then there's extensive analysis available to you to help you make the transformation. I wrote those transforms. I tested those transforms. It took me a month to write those transforms. Sometime between now and tomorrow, I have to pull a month out of my hat to do that for Release 3, Release 4. If anybody thinks that that's something they might want to contribute to, I'd love to hear from you. Because right now, I did a very thorough review last week of my job list between now and drop dead date for publishing the normative spec, and this is the piece that I don't know how is going to happen. So if anybody wanted to contribute, that'd be lovely. And I'm happy to work with you to get you going and actually writing the transform scripts and doing analysis for that. But you do. In point of fact, you need to be relatively inside the FHIR process, because what happens is you look at the Release 3 and the Release 4 definitions for a resource, and you work through them and you say, some of the resources hardly anything's changed, like patient, nothing changed. But then others, you look at it, you go, I don't really understand how the committee thinks there's any comparison between this part of the resource in Release 2 and this in Release 3. In fact, the committee probably says, nah, we just changed our mind. And you can't change, you can't write the transform. But sometimes you need to go to the committee and go, well, I mean, what were you thinking? And sometimes they go, oh, we didn't think about that bit. We'll change our mind again. So it's very much an inside process task. But I'd love to have some of you go, hey, we will help out with that process, because that's our primary resourcing issue for the core spec right now. Okay, but in more general, there's no magic bullet for supporting multiple versions. We've made changes most often because our understanding of the requirements changed. And that's why we're in trial use phase, because actually the principal difficulty that we're dealing with is trying to figure out what the requirements are that we need to take on and the ones that we shouldn't take on. And so our requirements analysis changes, and that impacts on our implementers. So there's no magic bullet to say, oh, you could write some magic transform that changes things, because there's very few changes for infrastructure. There's a few, but not many. Okay. We added graph support. This is still draft, GraphQL support. So we've described how you can use GraphQL with FHIR gets and even posts to vary what comes back. So in a simple case, you make a query, you get a resource back, you process the resource. And that's all pretty cool until you start writing real apps. And you find yourself going backwards and forwards between the server again and again and getting heaps of data you didn't use, and it's a lot of latency to get the data you do use. So GraphQL can short circuit that by letting the server do all your walking for you. It'll walk through the data, drop the data you don't want, and fetch the data you do want, and just give it back to you in a single nice package like a prepped view. And it's not a perfect language. If I designed it, it would be heaps better. Or not. But it's a language with quite a lot of community support behind it. Facebook defined it. It's got quite an impetus to it. So GraphQL allows either the server or the client to specify what's returned, to collapse unneeded depth out of the specification, and to split lists up for make it easy for the client. to process the data. So it's a very powerful technique. Currently, it's only supported, to my knowledge, by test.fhir.org and happy.fhir.org, or Happy Server in general. We have an R client, which is in one of the standard R packages for FHIR, which supports and leverages the GraphQL abilities. You write GraphQL to square your data up into analyzable squares, and that's what R is really good for. It's a stats language. I see a lot of people asking on the Zulip chat about issues about how they can get better interactions between the client and the server, and proposing that we do some kind of denormalization or renormalization or some kind of change around the spec for making a particular client challenge easier. And almost all those problems can be solved by using GraphQL well. But at the moment, not many servers support GraphQL. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg problem, right? People aren't really pushing to use GraphQL because the servers aren't really using it. Servers aren't really making it available because no one's really using it. So we kind of got a chicken and egg problem. So I encourage you to look at that part of the spec. I encourage you to encourage your FHIR server of choice to make it available. And there is plenty of library support for GraphQL. But in the end, it's, you know, you're putting a significant server load onto the server from the client, and there's a price to pay for that for servers. Okay. And so John Holunka talked about this just before. We're adding bulk data support. So we're expanding the FHIR API to support extraction of large amounts of data. So that means adding an API for supporting long-running requests, defining formats that are suitable for large amounts of data, and defining the semantics to allow you to request a large amount of data. So this is stuff that's always been on our radar and our plan. Now we've gotten to it. So there's an implementation guide maintained by the Smart Health group here at Boston, and the primitive operations it describes are actually in the specification as draft operations. So technically, there's backend services authentication, so a certificate exchange between client and server, because typically the client will be a server in its own right. An asynchronous request pattern where you can make a request to the server and the server will get back immediately and say, okay, I'm working on it, and here's how to find out how it's going, and you can continuously query the location till you get the actual outcome from the server. So that's a much more robust protocol for very large amounts of data. For format, we're using the JSON format for the resources, but packaged as a series of resources using new line delimited JSON. We've been discussing continuously whether you should use Avro or Parquet or Protobuf. Patrick, hand up Patrick. Patrick's going to talk about Protobuf on Thursday, I think. Yeah, and we'll see how we go with Protobuf. But Avro, Parquet, and Protobuf are much more efficient format storages, but they're much harder to work with than JSON and are much less robust version change than NDJSON. And so we're at the moment we're focusing on NDJSON and all using that. And there are converters to convert to those other formats. And so that's work in progress. For me, this is a significant part of the spec because a lot of people engage with the specification for very interactive, very workflow-focused use cases. I'm in a clinical workflow. I'm dealing with one patient on one exchange. But you know, there's all sorts of other data analytics use cases where you do move lots of data. So there's lots of breaking changes between release 3 and release 4. Following the maturity model, which really is not something that we impose on the process, it's the organic behavior of the process that we run. Following the maturity process, the mature resources, the breaking changes that we've introduced are mostly around edge cases. Sometimes we have to make an infrastructural breaking change to handle an edge case, and there's a few of those, but mostly they're around edge cases. In the less mature parts of the spec, The breaking changes can be pretty extensive, all the way down to renaming a resource and changing its scope and basically starting from scratch again. So in the past, I haven't published a list of breaking changes. I've called out some very, very big ones. This is one of the last things I do when I publish Release 2 or Release 3. It takes me about 2 weeks solid work to do all the quality checking and get make sure everything's perfect. And one of those things that I do is actually prep the change list. And typically I've ended up in GForge looking at 2,500 changes, tasks labeled breaking changes. And it's not worth listing 2,500 breaking changes, right? No one's going to read that. But maybe that's changing now, so I'll be reassessing that, and I'm happy to receive comment and input about that. The normative content in particular, it's likely where we're likely to be looking at iterating the breaking changes. There's actually a specific substantive changes list for changes between the last ballot and the next ballot. Every single change that would impact on an implementation as in normative content will be listed right here, right in the page. It's in the ballot introduction page. And that list is probably going to be fairly long and very, very detailed, and that's a ballot service for balloters. It's not an implementer service for implementers. At the foot of every page, there's a diff link. How many people have noticed a diff link at the bottom of every page? Yeah, that's what I thought. So you can see it right here. At the foot of every page, you compare to the last specification. And so that fires up a W3C diff service that shows you a list of the differences in the pages from the last version to the current version. Anybody who's doing work with more than one FHIR version should know and love that link. I do. It's not the world's best HTML diff program, but it's the only one I ever found that actually runs correctly and runs on the web. So I recommend that you look at that. We will continue to maintain interversion conversion maps and diffs, which I already showed you. I don't know whether I'll get them done for Ballot. Maybe if lots of people say, hey, we want to take that problem on, that'll help. But it will have to happen before we publish Release 4. And actually with Release, for those of you who really care, in Release 4, I will publish Release 2 and Release 3 and Release 4 definitions in Release 2, Release 3 and Release 4 formats as part of the actual package, like a full grid of all the possibilities. And all the diffs will be there, and the conversion scripts will be there, and we're doing what we can to help implementers deal with ongoing version changes. But as I said, when a committee changes the requirements, it's not something you can solve technically inside the specification. That's something implementers have to go, hey, how does that requirements change impact on what we're doing? Okay. We have, to my knowledge, one open issue where I don't believe we've landed on the breaking changes question. So right now, there's an open question around the JSON format. How many people know what I'm talking about? A few. So those of you who work with the JSON format, which is most of us, not all of us, but most of us, you'll know that when you run into what we call a string, what we call a string is actually a complex. That's an element with extensions and an ID and a string. And in XML, that's an element with a value that's the primitive value of the string, and then an ID and extension sub-elements. In JSON, we did, instead of creating an object with a property for the value of the string, we actually said, no, the value of the property is the primitive value. And if in the rare cases you care about extensions, if you care about them, then you put underscore and then the element name, and then you put all the extensions. So there's a few people in the room who were here for that original discussion 6 years ago, why we do that. It works really well for client developers. who rarely encounter extensions, mostly don't care about them, and their life is much simpler because they don't have to worry about every value has a value, right? So it's easy for them. But if, on the other hand, you're taking the JSON and running the JSON into some kind of JSON data store, there's heaps of them now, it doesn't matter which one, and doing bulk data analysis and writing a whole full-blown server on top of a JSON database, the fact that we do extensions that way is something you have to handle for every single primitive in case. So it's actually a pretty negative value proposition for someone who's dealing with large amounts of data rather than a server operator. So the current JSON format is strongly optimized for clients rather than servers. And when we did that, one of the things we said was, that's okay, we don't mind that. But the server operators ain't too happy about that. And they keep bringing it up, saying, you could really do a better job. And this is kind of last call this week on this subject. And I've said to them, can you get people caring about this? And the answer seems to be no. And it seems to be we're going to go with what we've got. But that really is last call on this. So if you're interested in this, you can come talk to me, or you can track the Julep thread and make input on Julep, because we're kind of counting, right? We had enough people to care about it. Otherwise, it's done. All right. New content in the spec. There's lots of new content coming in the spec, and our pace is increasing on this. Public health case reporting, occupational data, test catalogues, blood transfusion and other stock control for biological products, medical device nomenclature, insurance plans. We're working on subscription. People wanted to talk to me about that when I came through the door. And we're also looking at medication registration process. And I didn't have space on the slide, but we're now looking at guideline aggregation and analysis and sharing guidelines. And for me, that rounded out the set of content that John Halamka was talking about in terms of a learning healthcare system that's computable. But some of these are very long-term projects because they're really, really new space. I'll finish up by talking about the FHIR Foundation. HL7 develops the FHIR standard. It owns the standards process. Governance process and policies are focused on publishing standards. And the Ballot process I talked about, that's an HL7 process. But HL7 is geared to supporting standards. And the FHIR community is about much more than that. FHIR community is very implementation focused. So we have the FHIR Foundation to support the implementation community. So we provide a bunch of infrastructure, so all the FHIR.org servers. We support collaboration groups that don't need the formal process. If you've got hundreds of stakeholders, you need a formal standards process. But if you've got 3 or 4 stakeholders, you probably don't need a standards process. You don't want an HL7 formal standard. There's a cost associated with that. That's where the FHIR Foundation comes in and says, hey, well, we can help you with that. We can be your curation, and we can provide you with governance that isn't the full standard stack. And we could, and we have some discussion around this, run actual servers for integration work on behalf of other partners. And we run the registry, which is our most important service. Okay, so if I look across where we are, things are really humming here in the US. We have got more regulatory and legislative interest than we can deal with. I was visiting Washington trying to keep up with that yesterday. We're still outside US trying to support and encourage national adoption. We do need to improve our support for aggregate data reporting, and that's something that a few of us are working on. The CDS hooks add on to the, as part of the FHIR ecosystem is really important. We're bringing that to our first ballot. We'll be doing more investment in FHIR.org services. And what I would really like us to see to work towards is a reusable formal review process. So that's where we can call for a review on a particular profile or value set or resource. And everyone can comment and we can go through an actual formal review process on it. The really good thing about if we do that properly is it would be just as usable for a clinical case review, which would be pretty cool. And we need to work on endpoint discovery. So in practice, so those are things we're working on. All these changes reflect the growing maturity of the specification and the community around it, but we still have plenty to be done. And I just wanted to finish by saying that we have very strong support from the ONC, and without that support, FHIR Release 4 would not happen. So we're very appreciative of ONC support in that regard. Okay, thank you. And I don't know how many minutes I got for questions. None, I'm told it's over, done. So no.